Let's look at the similarities first. So there are certainly some things that I think home brewers and commercial brewers pretty much do exactly the same. Water treatment. You know, you get your water from good old Lake Erie via the city of Cleveland, or you have a well, or wherever your municipality is, and you treat that water maybe by running it through a carbon filter, getting the chlorine out in the simplest case, or maybe you do a reverse osmosis or ion exchange, something like that. We've had plenty of talks about that here. It's the same technology, you just scale it up larger. Ingredients, same thing. You know, we all use basically the same malts, the same hops. We have the same access to yeast cultures through various yeast banks. The only difference, I guess, is that on a commercial scale, because you turn the raw materials over faster and you have better purchasing power, then the freshness of those ingredients can be an advantage, you know, especially when it comes to malt and hops at a commercial scale. And then there's packaging. So bottles and kegs. I mean, home brewers put their beer in bottles and kegs. I see plenty of bottles around here, and then there's plenty of draft beer available. So that essentially that's the same technology, although a lot of home brewers will bottle condition. Not too many commercial brewers do, but there are some. But then again, you have, you know, the Blickman beer gun or these other things that you can just fill bottles right out of a keg, and you know, it's kind of the same idea. The technology is a little bit different in a commercial brewery just because it's faster and you have rotary filling lines. But you know, we're not going to talk too much about that. I don't see anybody canning their beer at the homebrew level yet. But give it time, right? So what are some of the differences? This is what the talk's all about. I see differences in milling, mashing, lautering, boiling, wort cooling, aeration, fermentation control, and then finally carbonation, especially in-tank carbonation. So pretty much all of it, yeah. All right. So this is a schematic of our milling system, just a snapshot from our little control panel at work. And what you've got here, that guy over there is a big bag station. So we get these super sacks full of malt. And so that's where the malt's coming from, the Pilsner malt or the pale malt. And then right next to that, you have a hand dump station. So that's where we add 55-pound bags of other specialty malts. And that's all being conveyed through this thing in the middle, which is a malt cleaner. And that's a very nice thing to have. And that's something that commercial brewers would have, but typically a home brewer would not. And it's a rotating drum. It's kind of a sieve, and it's getting all the non-malt material out and separated out. So if you've got rocks or stones or a lot of husk material, or God forbid, like beetles or anything like that, that's all going to get sorted out. And the way it's being conveyed, too, you see this kind of loop-de-loop thing going around here? That's a chain disc conveyor that we have. Other breweries will use augers. Some people, you know, larger breweries will use these various other conveying systems. So it'll be pneumatic or paddles kind of thing. But a chain disc is like a big bicycle chain. Goes in a big loop, and it's got plastic discs about every 6 inches, and just gets pulled through this round tube, and it's very gentle. That's the idea, is that you convey the malt very gently, especially after you mill it, because when you mill the malt, that's the way you want it to be. And then after you've milled it, you want to get it into the mash tun without damaging it any further or degrading it. So that's why we invested in that. And then finally, after the cleaner, then it goes into the mill. So the mill is represented on the top there. It's like an in-feed. And then there's the mill, and it sits on top of a grist case. That's our way of batching. So that sits on load cells, and so you can figure out how much you're putting through there. And there's a picture of a mill. So it's a 4-roller mill. And there's a variety of types of mills that commercial breweries use. The most basic is a 2-roller mill, so it's just 2 rolls, you know, running. You dump the beer or the malt through, and it crushes it, hopefully fairly gently. In a 4-roller mill, you have 2 rolls and then another set of rolls right below it. And in this, you can see there's some handles here for setting the gap on each set of rolls. And the idea is that the upper roll is fairly loose. You just want to kind of crack the endosperm open and leave the husk largely intact. And then the husk will then flow through the second set of rollers. The second set of rollers is set closer and that really kind of crushes the starch into a finer flour, so you can really access all the material for mashing. More complicated mills would be 6-roller mills, which typically look just like that. It's 2/2, and then you have a separator screen, then you have the last set of rolls. So what that's doing is the same as a 4-roller mill, but then the screen is separating out more of the husk material and the flour, and then the last set of rolls is doing even more fine degrading of the starch. And pretty much each step of the way is costing you X amount more money. But a 4-roller mill is typically what you'd see in something the size of our brewery, or like Fatheads or something like that. 6-roller mill would be a larger, maybe 100,000 barrel a year plus brewery. There's also options around this. You can do what's basically hydration of the malt before it gets to the mill. And so basically you're hitting it with a little bit of hot water or steam, and there's a big screw slowly turning, feeding into the mill. And what that does is it raises the moisture on the grain just by a couple of percentage points, maybe from, typically it's about 4.5% moisture. If you get that up to 6%, then the malt mills that much better. The outer husk of the barley kernel just tends to pop right off, which is a really good thing because the husk is what affects your lautering. So that's one option. Another is just called wet milling, and that's where basically you're mashing in as you're milling. So you have a big steep tank above the mill. The mill is all stainless steel, and it's just a 2-roller mill. And you're mixing the water with the malt before it's milled. All that flows through the mill, and so the water and the grist, they're crushed together, and then it immediately is pumped into the mash tun. So that's a much more complicated system, and you can probably imagine the cleaning problems that are inherent in that, but a lot of the bigger breweries will do that. Bell's Brewery up in Kalamazoo, they have one. They love it. Victory had one in their original Downingtown location. They hate it. So, it just depends. But it's an interesting technology. And milling is very important. It's really the first step in brewing. I like to call it the first vessel in the brew house, even though it's not a vessel. But it's so directly related to your whole performance in your brew house. A big critical step. So if you're using a crappy little Corona mill, back in the day we used to use those. You put a drill on it and just pulverize the shit out all your malt. Don't do that. Get something that's got rollers, or if the homebrew store can grind it for you, maybe do that. But milling your own malt's also advantageous, just because malt freshness leads to beer freshness. So everything's kind of interrelated when it comes to brewing. The idea of mashing is that you're mixing malt and water. And in a homebrew situation, you basically dump a bunch of malt into your picnic cooler with some hot water and stir it up with a wooden paddle. Hopefully you get your temperature correct. And if not, you can maybe add a little hot water. If you're doing a single infusion, that's how most people do it. In a commercial brewery, typically you're doing this in a vessel that is all stainless steel, and it has steam jackets, and it has a mixer in the bottom. It also has what's called a grist hydrator. So as the malt is coming in, it's being mixed with water in this little basically tube. So as the malt is coming into the mash tun, it's already mixed with water. And what that does is prevent starch balls from forming. If you ever mixed a mash and you've added your malt a little too fast, or whatever, you get these little dough balls that are kind of floating around there, and then you got to poke at them and try and break them up. And in a commercial brewery, that can be a problem because these starch balls, these dough balls, can be about the size of a basketball floating around in there if you don't do it right. And that's not a good thing, especially if you've got a fairly large tank and you're trying to poke at it with some kind of stick. So grist hydration is very important. And then the next thing is the mixer. So we have a mixing paddle in there. And what it's doing is it's not only just spinning around, but it's got angled blades, and they're creating a rolling motion. So as the mash is mixing it this way, it's also going up and down. And you're getting a really nice rolling motion. And that allows you to turn the steam jackets on so you can raise the temperature. And so this is a big advantage, in my opinion, in commercial brewing. to do step mashes. So you can start at a low temperature, say, hydrate everything, get it all mixed together to 130, 131 degrees, and then you can bump it up to 145 and get the beta amylase going, do a rest there, then take it up to like 158, get the alpha amylase kicking in, and then finally mash it off at 170. So you have good control of all the enzymatic activity in your mash, especially if you want to play around and do things like German-style Hefeweizen. There you want to mash in much lower and get the ferulic acids forming around 110, 113 degrees, and then you can bump it up from there. So the ability to tailor your mash and those temperatures to specific enzyme activity is really important because that affects how the beer is going to attenuate through fermentation. How dry is it going to be? How malty is it going to be, right? And all that adds up to mouthfeel and also to foam. Foam's an important characteristic, and over mashing can lead to poor foam. So a lot of things to think about there. But the ability to get it in there, mix it up really well, heat it up, and have good precise temperature control are keys to mashing. Then the next step is lautering, right? So this is an example of a lauter tun, and you see the false bottom. It's the milled stainless steel plates, right? And these are really nicely fitted, so there's no gaps. You don't want malt just kind of going underneath the plates and then getting carried through into the kettle. And these are milled with precise slot widths, right? So it's a little more than just taking a hacksaw to some copper tubing. And these are actually double milled, which means you've cut a slot this way through the stainless steel material, which is not this thick, but just as an example, right? So you've cut a slot, and then you're going to mill out underneath that. And what that does is prevent things from hanging up and getting stuck. It's kind of expensive, but it's worth the money in the long run. And then up above that, you see this raking mechanism. And this is kind of the, Germans spend a lot of time writing textbooks and stuff about this and doing research. But you have basically two kinds of rakes. You have the zigzaggy things with the shoes on the bottom. And then on the other side, you see this kind of straight bar with these flights. And both are serving a purpose. The straight with the flights is about making sure that everything is just kind of evenly spaced and sorted, and the flights are kind of angled upward to lift the grain as you're slowly raking to keep the work flowing through. And then the zigzag things with these little shoes, those are called Lenza knives after the engineer that invented it. The zigzags are to make sure that all the areas that the straight ones get or don't get, the zigzags are. So you're kind of exposing pretty much the entire lauter bed to some kind of cutting and lifting activity. And then if you notice the shoes, they're definitely angled upward. So the idea is to lift the malt a little bit. So you can do a really deep cut, which is what you need to do right before you start sparging, because the grain, as you're running off the first wort, the grains start to compact, the husks start to compact, and they go from being nicely separated like this, and then you just start getting drawn down. So lift it up, fluff it up a little bit, keep the flow going hopefully without clouding up all the wort and having to kind of start to foil off over again. But that raking mechanism, that's probably the key to commercial lautering that most homebrewers really don't have access to. A lot of brew pubs don't actually have that. I know at our brew pub, the rake is a paddle, and you go in there, you just kind of make some cuts by hand and do a lot of praying. But in a good lauter tun, like in our new commercial brewery, the production brewery, we have a similar setup like this, and it's pretty nice. We went from using rice hulls to help with our runoffs on our wheat beers to not needing them. That's the difference. Then there's boiling. So this is another screenshot from our brewery. There's a lot of different ways to boil wort, right? But essentially it's really two ideas. I call it two-phase boiling. First is you want to sterilize the wort, right? So you got to get it up to 212 degrees, maybe a little bit higher, and that's what everybody here does when they're boiling, right? And that's, make it microbiologically stable. That gives your yeast the best opportunity to do their job. But there's another phase, which is just removing volatiles. And you can do that by basically vapor stripping or spreading the wort across like a china hat with a pump or an internal calandria. So this shows that we're set up with an external calandria, which is this guy over here. It's a big, tall shell and tube heat exchanger. This thing's about 10 feet tall. So we're coming out the bottom, going through a pump, pumping it up through. There's steam coming in the top, and then it comes back over here, and this little thing here represents the china hat. So it's basically like an inverted funnel. So the wort's coming down, and it spreads, and it goes out to the sides. And what that does is it basically spreads the wort into a thin film, so it maximizes the surface area and hence the ability to remove volatiles like DMS. It also helps to knock down foam, as it hits the side, near the side of the tank. And boilovers are commonly a problem on your kitchen stove or on your little burner in your garage, right? Me and my friend, when we were home brewing, we used to always joke about, well, let's add hops after the first boilover. But with this kind of system, essentially you don't boil over, which is kind of nice. And that two-phase boiling is kind of nice because you don't have to boil for 40 or for 60 minutes or 75 minutes or 90 minutes. Really, you only need about 20 minutes to do the sterilization part of it. And then you can do the volatile aromatic removing for another 20 minutes or 40 minutes or however long. You can go back and forth between the two. So you can actually remove the volatiles with the steam turned off, and just by pumping it around. Again, this is something the Germans get very excited about because they want to save energy, because energy is very expensive over in Europe. But it's also good for your wort stability and for the beer stability. And this is something commercial brewers think a lot about. I have to put my beer out in the marketplace, and it has to taste good 4 months from now, even though somebody's stacked it up warm in a grocery store, which they should not do, but they still do. And the more exposure your wort or your beer has to heat, the more problematic your shelf life becomes. So you have this index, this thiobarbituric acid index. That's a great one to remember, right? Paul Schick's not here, so we won't worry about that. But these TBI values are something you can measure in your lab, and it gives you kind of an indication of how much exposure your wort has had to heat, and you can kind of track that and say, okay, we could probably correlate that to taste panel sensory analysis down the road, and the higher our TBI values are, probably the less our shelf life is going to be. So fun stuff to think about, right? There's another video that's not a video. So this shows the vapor stripping effect from this wort raining down off the china hat. It'd be a lot more sexy if it was actually working. But it's also very hard to shoot any kind of video of a boiling kettle just because there's a lot of steam involved. But anyway.
Andy, you can't do the equivalent in home brewing to this because you'd probably aerate your wort and stuff by pumping it around and stuff in that environment.
The question is, can you do this at home, and would there be a problem with wort aeration because you're pumping it around? I would say the biggest problem at home is you don't have steam. Yeah, you usually have direct fire. Now you can do some things with direct fire. You could do you could make some kind of internal calandria that would focus the wort upward and then cross a spreader and come back down. But it's a lot more complicated, to build such a device.
Percolator?
What's that? A percolator, yeah, exactly. If you had steam or wanted to get fancy, then you could do something with an external wort boiler. But I think it's probably more headache than it's worth. But it is interesting to think about. Like, we use 15 psi steam to boil our wort. And at 15 psi, that's about 260 degrees Fahrenheit. Whereas a direct fire kettle with propane gas as the source is somewhere around 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface there. There's a big difference there. Think about the scorching effect and those TBI values flying through the roof. That's why you don't see too much direct fired stuff on a commercial level. That, and it's just very inefficient. Steam's a lot more efficient. And yet, despite all that, we still like to caramelize our wort, so some of our Scotch ales. Wort cooling. This is something that some homebrewers have a very similar setup, but not many. This is a stainless steel. Well, maybe not like this, but. So this is a wort cooler. It's a plate heat exchanger.
How much for that?
It's in the raffle next week. You just got to carry it home. So this has stainless steel plates, right? A lot of people use a copper immersion coil, which is very common, or some people use copper counterflow, where you actually pour the wort through it and it cools. And then some people have the little, like, sealed stainless steel, what do they call them? Therminator, yeah, those things. Blickman makes one. But the difference, I guess, with this is that it can be taken apart, which all the little stainless steel ones that I've seen for home brewing are sealed. And so you don't really know what's stuck in there. And believe me, stuff does get stuck in there. So, yeah, you got to worry about that. But my advice is always clean these things backwards and forwards at least 1.5 to 2 times the flow rate of what you're putting through it. And use hot water and hot caustic. But if you're using copper, you might want to go easy on the caustic, because then you won't have any copper left after a while. But those things are, you use them for a while, you throw it away, get another one. And this is also quite efficient. So we use a tank full of cold water for our wort cooling, and we just run that cold water through on one side and the hot wort on the other, and we recover the hot water that's coming out, and we just use that for the next mash cycle. That's pretty common in the industry. After you cool the wort, then you got to aerate it or add oxygen somehow for yeast to grow. And I realized I didn't have a picture of this thing, and so I had to go back through my archives. This is our wort aeration panel. This is before it was actually installed. But this very expensive looking hunk of hardware, which all these little pipes, is just to put air, sterile air, into the wort stream as it goes from the wort cooler to the fermenter. And the whole idea is you have right here an air filter, and then you got a flow meter so you can control the amount of air that you're adding, and it comes down and it injects it. That's the wort pipe right there, and it injects it in through a tiny little orifice nozzle, kind of like a venturi, like a jet. A 2-component jet is technically what it is. And the idea is that by squeezing it and increasing the pressure and then releasing it, you're mixing the air with the wort really intensively. And then you have to have so much distance of downstream pipe to make it sure it all absorbs. But why air? You can easily use bottled oxygen, but oxygen is problematic. You can actually over-oxygenate your wort, plus you have to buy oxygen all the time. But you can, a lot of brew pubs do that. We actually do that at our brew pub at Market Garden. We still use a cylinder of oxygen. But this thing is, we find it gives better, cleaner fermentations and gives us much more precise control. So if you want 9 parts per million of oxygen for a Pilsner, you can dial it right in and then just confirm that with a dissolved oxygen meter. So it's pretty nice. And this thing uses steam. You can actually steam sterilize the entire system, which is really important because steam's a really good sterilizing media. So enough on that. But your equivalent would be, splashing the hose in the bucket. That works too, but it's not quite as sterile.
Do you have a recommendation if you use pure CO2 in a stone, how long, like a 5 or 10 gallon batch should be oxygenated for?
How long to oxygenate? I can't recommend because I don't know what the absorption rate is. It would depend on how cold the wort is and how vigorously you're bubbling it, and
What the size of bubbles are?
there's just a lot of variables that come into that. Yep.
With straight air with that system instead of using O2, what's the highest level of oxygen you can get into that wort?
We can slow the wort flow down if we really want to jack up the values, but it tops out around 12 to 14 parts per million. So that's one of the nice advantages, is that you can't really actually over-oxygenate. But if you're making a really big beer, you might actually want to plug in a little extra oxygen if you need it. Yeah.
I meant to ask, is it better to over-oxygenate instead of under?
Yes, it is better to have more O2 than less because the theory is that the yeast will absorb what they need and then they will start fermenting, and as they are fermenting and creating CO2, that will scrub the remaining oxygen out. But what we found in our brew pub, sometimes where we're using medical grade oxygen, we would just set the flow meter like, it looks good, fermentations are good. Then we bought a dissolved oxygen meter and started testing. And we're like, well, where are we at? Are we getting 12 or 15 parts per million? Oh, we're getting 45. Woo! That's a lot of oxygen. And you can actually create some kind of weird off flavors that way with just having too much oxygen in there. You can kind of burn the yeast and maybe it just gets unhappy. But anyway, that's probably not a problem. It could be, I guess, if you're just sitting there with an oxygen bottle and a little stone and you're just bubbling overnight, Yep.
You just made a over 12% beer, right? I think I saw some kind of.
Yeah, we got one that's like 15.5. Yeah.
So did you run it back through that machine halfway through? Like, how did you?
Well, we did that at the brew pub, and so we just used medical O2. But no, we just oxygenated it once, and it was good. Yeah. There's other tricks to making high gravity beers, but that's a different talk.
Next month.
Yeah. So next piece of technology, this is pretty obvious, I think, to anybody that's been in a commercial brewery. The first thing that you automate is your fermentation control, right? So you have temperature control on your tanks. And so this is just a schematic representing that. It shows that basically we have glycol that circulates in jackets around the tanks, and we can set these tanks at whatever temperature we want. And because fermentation is exothermic, it's giving off a lot of heat, you've got to be able to take that heat away, and that's why you're circulating glycol. But what you want to do is have pretty good control over that. So we want to be plus or minus 1 degree Fahrenheit. We don't want a lot of drift. So we can see that we've got in tank 74, we've got an ale at 64 degrees. In tank 73, we've got a lager at 55. 72 and 71, those are cooling mode, so they are knocked down to 28 degrees, which is a very nice temperature for getting your beer down to, because that helps to make it very clear and biologically very stable. And then the last tank is just waiting to be filled. It's been cleaned. Home brewers actually have a distinct advantage over professional brewers when it comes to fermentation, in that if you're using a carboy or a bucket, you can actually see what the heck's going on in there. That's really nice to be able to look in and just see all that stuff rolling around and bubbling, and look at your yeast, and you can just, what's going on. In a tank like these large stainless tanks, you can't. We have a blow-off pipe that comes down to a bucket, and that's our airlock, and you can kind of just gauge by how much gas is coming out what's going on, and you can take your daily hydrometer readings and things. But it is kind of nice just to see what's going on inside a tank. So you can, if you want, if you have a top manway, you can just pop the lid open and take a look. I don't do that very often, but for the sake of a picture, I did. And it's nice just to see, okay, there's all the yeast, there's the krausen kind of floating around on top. In traditional breweries, they would actually start with an open fermentation tank, big tub, get it started, and then once the krausen is really rocking and rolling and starts to subside, then you'd send it down to another tank to finish out. That's kind of nice, but it's an extra step, and it's an extra possibility for microbial contamination, so it's not as popular these days. Extra tank, yeah. More tanks, more cleaning, more work. Good for the union, right? Here's something that commercial brewers can do. Home brewers can do this, but typically don't. It's called spunding, and this is where near the end of fermentation in a tank, you cap the tank. You stop venting the CO2 out into that bucket, and you put on a little pressure regulator right here. So you can set that to whatever pressure you want. In this case, we've developed on the gauge, you can see that's about 10 pounds of gas pressure. So as the fermentation is going near to completion, maybe 1 or 2 degrees Plato above terminal gravity, or 0.04 to 0.08 specific gravity points. You put this thing on and the remaining CO2 just redissolves naturally back into the beer and carbonates it that way. And the big advantage to doing that is that you get a really nice, tightly beaded carbonation. Carbonation that's naturally generated is just much better for the beer than injecting it through a stone or putting it in your corny keg and rolling around on the floor and shaking the shit out of it. That works, but you know, if you've ever done keg conditioning or bottle conditioning and compared that to force carbonating, you probably can see the difference. The smaller, tighter, more densely packed bubbles, they make great foam. That foam stands better over time. And pretty much everything in a brewery kind of impacts foam, you know. There's an old saying that you only make foam once. So if you're forcing your beer into a bright beer tank or in a keg and jamming a bunch of CO2 in it, and then, whoops, got it too high, got to vent it down, and now it's too low, and now I can put some more in. You start jacking it around like that. That beer is never really going to have a nice, tight head. It's going to be more fizzy, dissipating.
Now, when did you say that you start the spunding when the fermentation is almost complete?
Yeah, so you have to have an idea when your fermentation is going to end to do that. And you can do that either through knowing by your daily gravity checks, you know, where it's at, or you can do an accelerated rapid fermentation in your lab with a small sample, check that within 24 hours and know what your actual terminal should be. There's a couple different ways to do it. But mostly it's just by experience, like, okay, our Pilsner always ferments down to 3 Plato, so at 4.5 or 4, time to stop venting the gas and start recarbonating. And you have to have a tank, obviously, that can hold the pressure. And this is what most homebrewers do not have, although you probably do. If you have Cornelius kegs, you could actually either ferment in them and then just, you know, stop venting, or you could ferment in a carboy and then, you know, with 1 or 2 degrees left, rack it into the corny keg. Things to think about if you want to, you know, be racking your beer at midnight. And you have to be able to, you know, most home brewers don't check their gravity every day. It's just, you know, that's a lot of beer you're pulling out that you're not going to get back. It's a little different when you have more beer to play with. So that all leads up to nice beer with attractive foam, which is kind of what we're after, right? Hopefully properly attenuated and properly carbonated and delicious. And with that, I say thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, I got a question. When you grind your malt, you guys use a sieve to check your mill's performance, right?
Yes, the question is, when we mill our malt, we have a sieve that we can use to check our milling, and yes, we do that.
For a home brewer, is there a good way for us to just kind of look at what we're grinding and get? I mean, those sieves are expensive.
Yeah, sieves are expensive. You kind of want to just look at it, and you should see all your husks in as big and fluffy a condition as possible. You don't want to see a whole bunch of jagged, torn little husks. You want to just see nice, you know, pretty, not whole, but at least half size husk material. And you don't want to see whole kernels. That means you've missed it. You also don't want to see too much flour.
What about whole kernels, but when you rub them in your hands, they fall apart? They break, they're cracked.
Yeah, that's good.
Is that not enough because you don't have enough flour? Or
That should disintegrate during mashing, you know, with enough stirring. That depends on how much you stir your mash, though. But at least they've been cracked. That's the main thing. They've got to be cracked open to get, you know, access to the starch.
Is there a difference between stirring the mash and just recirculating the mash? I mean,
Yes,
you
I think
still
there is.
stir it?
Yes.
Still stir it.
Yeah, mechanical agitation is going to do wonders for your mash in terms of how fast it converts.
And efficiency, it'll increase your efficiency? All right.
Yep.
I got to start doing that.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Okay, no. Oh, Tim.
There's got to be a fine line with that China hat, where you're oxygenating hot water, you know, hot side aeration, and things like that. You know,
Well, actually, if you're boiling in a closed system, steam is preventing really any oxygen pickup. Steam drives oxygen away, so you don't have to worry about hot side aeration at that point.
So that's the difference because, so it's
When we're doing this, the manway door is closed. You don't need the door open.
so, but it's still vented though, right?
It's still vented, yep.
But it's regulated vented? I mean, it's got some back pressure?
No, it's just open to the atmosphere, it's just a pipe going to the roof. But steam is a great antioxidant.
So as long as you keep that going and that's funneled up and you're not picking up any oxygen from the splash.
Right. Yep.
Well, what is steam? I mean, steam is air, oxygen, water.
But it's not new oxygen.
Right.
Steam is water vapor.
Yeah, steam is water vapor, and oxygen is something that at those temperatures it just is gone. You know, it just goes away.
Are you a believer in hot side aeration?
I think hot side aeration could be a problem for you. You know, any oxidation, it can be potentially problematic to your final beer. I think probably most homebrewers don't have to worry about it a whole lot because you don't have to put your beer in a bottle and wait 6 months for somebody to try and drink it. You know, but then maybe you do. You know, I think it's probably more of an issue in mashing and lautering than it is in wort boiling. Yep.
So, you know, hands-on home brewer, I taste and taste and taste. I didn't hear you talking about like the hands-on, how you know things are going, the human element. There's all that machinery necessary. It's well designed for the process. How do you know it's like someone's making good beer?
We taste and taste and taste. Yeah.
Along the way, there's points where you're tasting.
Yeah, every day when you check fermentation, you taste it, as well as take the pH and the specific gravity.
That's why you never answers any texts after noon because he's already sleeping in the office.
Yeah. You should taste your wort in your mash. You should taste the wort out of the wort cooler as it's cold. You should taste your water, you know, that you're brewing with.
Which implies that sometimes you're going to taste something that doesn't agree with what the instruments are telling you, right? I assume. Why taste
You can. I mean, the best instrument you have is right here. Sensory. Yeah. A well-trained palate is a thing of beauty.
Awesome.
Yeah. Todd.
What are the specs on the brew house now that it's officially up and the palace is rolling?
In terms of,
Size, capacity?
oh, it's a 35 barrel system, so that's how much we're making with each batch. And ultimate capacity could be as much as 100,000 barrels, but that's a long way down the road.
How many barrels do your fermenters hold?
We have 70 barrel fermenters, and then we have some 210 barrel tanks. So either 2 brews or up to 6. But we can also short fill them, so we can do a single brew or we can do 3 or 4 brews. Yeah. So we have capacity to grow into. So we're probably going to do 5,000 to 6,000 barrels in this first year, which makes us a really, really overbuilt small brewery.
You're only bottling, right? You're not canning?
Correct, bottles and kegs.
Now, when you watch these mobile canning lines, these cans are going through and they're wide open, just like this glass.
They sure are.
And they're filling them up with beer. And, I mean, doesn't that get oxygen in the beer? Potentially
Yep.
more in the bottle?
Taste the beer out of a small can line. I've looked at them, and I ran screaming for the hills, right back to my beloved old bottle filler. Yeah.
They're wide open.
I mean, filling technology is something that's, you have to pay attention to it because that's the biggest single source of potential oxidation in your beer. You always start at the back of the brewery and work your way forward when you have oxygen problems. You don't start in the brew house. You start in the packaging line.
Cool.
All right, well, I put half of you to sleep, so I think I'm done.